Diversity in Writing podcast, the show where we as authors explore the better practices of writing inclusively, whether that be in terms of race, gender, ethnicity, class, sexuality, ability, and so on. Why are we here? To bring more depth and breadth to the characters in our fiction and represent them in the best way possible. My name is Bethany A. Tucker, and with me each week is my co-host, Mariëlle S. Smith. Ready? Let's dive in. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Doing Diversity in Writing. This is Season 3, Episode 6. And as I told all of you last time, I have another guest with me today. And so today I am joined by Eric Mills.
Hello.
Hey, thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
Eric is a licensed mental health counselor. He works with socially diverse adults in private practice, including members of the LGBTQIA+, BIPOC, traditional and non-traditional spiritual identities, and different social economic statuses. Before getting his master's in counseling at Adler University in Chicago, he worked in education in a number of settings. So I thought of asking Eric on to be with us today because he was probably my first professional sensitivity reader that I asked to work on my work. He was a reader for my Adelaide series under the Mustang Rabbit pen name. So thank you again for doing that. We did really have good conversations about that series when you were my reader.
Yeah, it was a really interesting experience. And I enjoyed it. And it gave me opportunity, as I'm always grateful to have, to expand myself and to put myself in shoes that are not my own, but also bringing things that I carry and things that I've seen and known.
And for me, having that, because I've had a lot of authors, writers, etc., read my work over the years, or people who were just like lay readers and they're like, yeah, I like it. And they don't say much more than that. Or they're like, it wasn't for me. And as authors, we all know that it's nice when someone reads our work, but you're always like trying to pull a little bit more out of people. Like, well, why did you like it? What didn't fit right? Like, it's like pulling teeth to get them out of a normal reader.
Or doing a clinical interview. It's a similar experience, I promise you, in some circumstances.
So what I appreciate when I gave you this book, and I came to you with a certain set of questions, and I'm not going to go into it because it was my personal project, but you were able to come to it with your background, the people you've served, your education, and it was a really good back and forth where I was able to get that perspective that I couldn't always get. And I will say that Eric is still available to do these sensitivity readings as a professional non-clinical consult. Did I get that right?
Yeah, that's pretty accurate. And I will take this opportunity to say that, I don't legally have to say this. I feel like it's legally encouraged, to borrow a phrase from the Very Bad Therapy podcast folk, to say that this does not constitute legal nor therapeutic advice. Everything I say here is informed by my experience as a professional. It's also not me telling you how to treat something that you're experiencing in your life. Hopefully we'll be here and live up to that mission of helping writers to be their best selves on the and off the page, and without getting into the territory of that professional stuff, as we mentioned earlier.
Today, we're going to talk about mental health for ourselves as writers, and we're also going to talk about mental health in fiction, the fiction that we're writing. Those two topics seem to flow really well together when we were talking about what we should go over. But before we do that, I really wanted to get some definitions and classes out of the way, because I know that I was very confused when I was first writing and researching for my own mental health that I was seeking. So can you just explain to us classes of counselors, medical providers, other mental health workers, because we often use these terms wrong.
Yeah, and it's not your fault. It really isn't. And by classes, I'm gonna make the assumption you're meaning professional roles or professional identities, right?
Correct.
One of the reasons why that I say that it's not your fault We didn't really let y'all figure this out. I'll just start with the general and work my way in.
Sounds good.
Yeah, so at the top, there's the term therapist. And therapist is an umbrella term. Usually it means somebody that's performing psychological therapy or psychotherapy. And again, like that could be a lot of different folk that do that. You do have to be licensed, at least in most states in the United States, to call what you're doing therapy or psychotherapy, right? The idea of a license is that it protects the public. It's just like a driver's license. We don't want somebody to just jump behind the wheel of a car who doesn't know what they're doing. That could be dangerous. So here's where I'll get into the difference of different types of therapists. Getting back to your original question. So a therapist is somebody that does psychotherapy. A psychiatrist is a medical doctor. You have to go through medical school to be a psychiatrist. My sister is a psychiatrist. Funny enough, she wouldn't consider herself a therapist. She would say she works in mental health, which sure, yeah, she does. But the way that she interacts with her patients is as a medical doctor prescribing medications to treat symptoms and illnesses associated with mental health.
All right, so we've had 3 terms so far. We've had psychologist, psychiatrist, and therapist. And you're saying that a psychiatrist isn't necessarily a therapist, but would a psychologist be a therapist?
If they are what they call a clinical psychologist, yes.
Okay. So let me put this in terms of like someone sitting down, they're writing a book, say their character is LGBTQ, they're seeking mental health in an modern urban center. What are the kind of people that their character might go to for mental health?
So if they're going into a lot of community in the United States, a lot of community mental health is done through kind of inclusive services. There's a special name for it that is escaping me, but the idea is that you go to one place and they're able to link you to services you need. So if somebody needs a doctor, then they get you a doctor. If you need psychotherapy, they get you a therapist. If you need medication, they'll link you to a prescriber or a psychiatrist, right? And so if they were to go in and they're like, yeah, this person needs psychotherapy, then there's a couple different folk that might provide that. It could be a clinical psychologist or a counseling psychologist, or we just call them psychologists for short in this setting. It could be a mental health counselor like myself. It could be a clinical social worker.
All right. So from an author perspective, I'm writing this book and I'm thinking about who my character is going to go see. Why would I have my character see a counselor, a clinical counselor like yourself, versus a psychologist? As I'm writing this, what would be some of the things that I would think about, a reason to have my character go to one or the other?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm laughing because in the real world, there's such less intentionality to when you're writing fiction. So it's so funny to see it through that lens. Because in the real world, a lot of times it's like, in organizations like, well, do we have the budget? Like a psychologist costs more than a counselor or a social worker.
Okay, why does a psychologist cost more?
Because they have a PhD by default. They politically they have more power. It's funny. There's these different identities: the counselor, social worker, psychologist, and the one I haven't touched on, which is what they call marriage and family counselors or relational counselors. They're all in the business of therapy, more or less. They all have different histories, and they sometimes have they generally have different approaches to training or different philosophies, depending. But if you're a psychologist, you have to have a doctoral degree, which is usually either a PhD or what they call a PsyD, which is a PSY capital D. And you can be a counselor like myself. I have my master's, I have my MA. You can be a doctor if you're a counselor. If I were to go and get the counselor ed and supervision degree, or in some places it's still a counseling psychology doctorate degree, then I would be Dr. Eric Mills. I would not be a psychologist unless I was licensed to be so. but I would have a doctor in front of my name, right? But again, part of what made counseling was that you could get people to do the human-to-human therapy services without having to do rigorous academic training and getting them to the level of doctorate.
Okay, so I'm going to follow this up with another question since you mentioned marriage and family. Say that I am writing a character who's going through marital problems with their partner. Do they have to see a marriage and family counselor for that issue, or could they see a counselor like yourself or a psychologist?
Yeah, so great question. I'm going to answer that indirectly first by explaining what a marriage and family counselor is, or a relational therapist is. Their training is much more geared towards working with more than one person, working with the system of people that are showing up for sessions. But the answer, surprisingly, is no. You do not have to see a licensed marriage and family therapist, an LMFT, or however it's called in your state or place of origin, the place of residence. I've worked with couples. At the end of the day, though, if you're just describing what's going on in a therapy space with a couple or a family, a lot of it's going to depend more on the person doing the therapy than it is necessarily like, well, how did their schooling look, right? Like there's a lot of, one of the reasons why people can't tell us apart is because therapy tends to be therapy at the end of the day. And there's a lot of overlap in what we, in our professional identities, tend to champion and believe.
So I think later on, we plan to talk more about what those different kinds of trainings look like, or at least different modalities look like. But I have two follow-up questions before we talk about the next section we plan to talk about. And one is children and addictions. Those are two big areas that you might see therapy show up when we're writing. A lot of us writers are dealing with really difficult topics, wrestling with topics that matter to our readers, matter to us as writers in our own lives. So children with trauma and addictions are two of those that'll show up. When we're writing this, do we need to be sensitive to what kind of specialists they're seeing? Are there specialties for this? Would that look different? What terms should we be looking up and using?
Yeah, a fantastic question. So I'll start with children. Almost every I think every program that I know of, with the possible exception of addictions counseling programs, which again, I'm probably wrong there. I would be shocked if they didn't also have to understand children too. We have to take some training or some coursework around what it's like to work with kids. I wish that it was more about what it's like to work with kids. A lot of times in the classroom, we focus on the theories of development, which from my perspective have some cultural challenges. There's certain theorists like Piaget who are cited all the time, who, like, if you actually get to know his methodology, you're kind of like, maybe we shouldn't base all of the human lifespan on the findings of this dude and his kids. But in any case, yeah, there's a great commercial that I saw in grad school advocating for children to advocating for therapy services for children, wherein they had this kid clearly coming home from school, and he's in like the school clothing. He's in the full jacket with the briefcase, and he proceeds to give this explanation of how it was such a bad day because his bully came in and gave him a swirly or something. And it's just so like hilarious how adult he sounds, right? And then like his mom comes up and tries to like put her hands on him, and he's like, oh no, I think I'm just gonna have a bath and some milk and call it a day.
That does not sound realistic at all.
Right. And that's why it made it such a great, hilarious commercials, because the point of it was that like kids don't process the world. They don't interact with the world. They don't make sense of their hardships the way that we as adults have built up things along the way, right? Adults tend to be the ones that rationalize what happened. We have to put it into words, and that tends to make us feel better about it. Kids, they want to play. They're overcome with emotion. They're going to look on the page very different than an adult who's having similar hardships or a similar level of distress. Excuse me. So there's modalities that are specific to children, such as play therapy. There's some that overlap. So like what do they call it? Sand tray therapy can also be used with adults, but it's also really good for working with kids. That's where you have a tray of sand, like a Zen garden, and you invite the client to place things in it that are meaningful to them. And you ask them, why is that there? Right? That's great for kids because you're exploring, you're engaging their creativity, curiosity. It's in a safe way. You're not asking them, what happened to you, kid? You're saying, well, what's important to you? Let's put it in this tray and let's see if what you put in the tray is meaningful in some way. And it will be, right? Otherwise they wouldn't have done it, generally speaking.
Exactly.
Yeah. So like if somebody, to bring it back to authors, if somebody's trying to write the classical therapy scene we see in movies, which I'm sure I'll get into why a lot of the times that scene is bullshit. It's not going to work with a kid. A therapist isn't going to like sort of have a breakthrough because they press the right button over and over. And finally the kid is able to show that emotion and have a good cry. And the therapist is like, yes, we've made progress. That's not how it usually happens with adults. And it sure as hell is not how it happens with kids. Kids tend to shut down. They tend to feel more threatened. They tend to look to the adult. So if you're going to start pushing them, they're going to try and tell you what they think you want to know. Right.
Yeah.
Right. So they're actually going to move away from the vulnerability that you might be trying to create in the scene. If your therapist person working with a kid is pushing them or trying to guide them to this place and it's too thought out, it's too cerebral. It has to be way more organic and authentic on just like a spontaneous level.
I think that's one of the reasons when I've looked into researching therapy for children, I've seen things like the play therapy you just said. I've also seen like equine therapy for kids has popped up a lot recently for me, where they take the kids and there's a counselor, social worker involved who is with them and then a horse handler and the kids get to do things on horses. I don't know if there's a specific modality for that, but you were saying play therapy and I remembered that.
Yeah. Would you like me to get into some of the animal assisted therapies real quick?
Real quick, yes, I would.
Yeah. So equine, I'll start with like pet therapy, like puppy therapy. Puppies
That's a
are
real
great.
thing.
It's a real thing. It's
because we joke about it all the time. As writers, we keep our animals very close. We post cat pictures all the time. They're sitting next to us on the desk. But yes, pet therapy.
Well, and I there might be a specific kind of, because again, we have a fancy name for everything. There might be a more clinical term for it. The use of emotional support animals in therapy, right? So that's like a therapist who brings their dog in and the dog becomes, it's not like, oh, I'm bringing my dog in because the dog sitter can't make it. Like for it to be pet assisted or emotional support animal assisted, they have to be a central part of what you're doing. So it becomes like, and this is not a modality I use, but I know that it activates certain systems in the body and the brain. So in some of the language and theories I know, it activates like the caretaking system, it activates the social system, de-escalates more of the defensive action system, right? And so that feels really good. With equine therapy, as I've heard, the person who used to run the counseling internship selection program at my school, she did equine therapy and it was even offered as a class. And I heard her talking about this and she said, yeah, puppies, you're sad, they're happy. You're happy, they're happy. You're surprised, they're happy, right? That's the role of puppies, right? Or most dogs that would be used in that capacity. Cats obviously might have a little bit more emotional depth in the space, but if they did, if they had too much emotional depth, they wouldn't be selected to do that work, right? Because you don't want a cat that's an asshole. Like,
I've met a lot of cats who are assholes.
Yeah, and that's probably not a good look for your therapy. So the thing though, she was saying, yeah, a puppy is always going to be a puppy. But if you stand next to a horse and you're timid, what does the horse do? If you're standing next to a horse and you're scared, what does a horse do?
The horse is going to check to figure out why you're scared. They're a herd animal.
We call it projection, where the horse becomes a thing in which you can see what you're feeling and it's outside yourself.
Like an antenna that amplifies whatever is going on inside of you that you're having trouble saying or expressing.
Yeah, like a mirror.
Okay.
Right. So I get to see, oh, well, how is this horse reacting? And there's ways to facilitate people having emotional growth and breakthroughs as a result of having that mirror.
I would say as an author, these ideas of using animals in therapy sessions gives me so many more options when I'm writing scenes, other than two people sitting in a room talking to each other. And that's exciting for me because as we do a lot of two people sitting in a room talking to each other as scenes, and you always want to introduce action, you want to introduce elements that are interesting, and
Mhm.
it is literally a joke in writing that you want to give the character an interaction with an animal or something, because it literally makes readers empathize with them more.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And from being somebody who works in those spaces and is trying to have encourage people and facilitate people to have their own growth, I can tell you that a lot of the times where people have their own growth, it's really powerful and meaningful to them and would probably make for shit fiction. Like it really, like the thing about when, and I'm speaking from somebody who uses a lot of newer modalities, as opposed to say classical cognitive behavioral therapy or psychoanalysis or dynamics, which we can get into a bit. But yeah, when people have that moment where it just clicks and they find something that's meaningful, or I lead them through a thing where they're able to release something that they've been carrying. I mean, the closest thing I'd say, there's a scene in the TV show Gotham, for your listeners that are familiar. Um, Hugo Strange, played by BD Wong, which was a brilliant cast in my take. They actually have this dramatic scene where sort of like non-consensual therapy happens in like this really intense kind of towards the end of the season thing. And it's done wrong. Let me just start by telling you that it was done wrong.
Well, you started with the non-consensual part.
Right. I mean, even if that wasn't the case, like the technique was performed incorrectly, because it puts BD Wong as like a god in the space, which is the whole point of the scene. Is like Hugo Strange is this godlike character. He's I think a psychiatrist that has a god complex. So like, of course he does it wrong. But if you watch what he does, he's helping to remove this burden that this character is having. And it's like the closest thing I've seen of like, oh yeah, that's similar to what I do and what I've seen that isn't quite right, but actually makes for good drama. A lot of the other stuff where people have breakthroughs in a space, it's a lot harder to have that be a major breakthrough point and still have it be good therapy, right? Maybe it could be like the detective show thing where it's like the therapist says something and they're like, oh yeah, oven, the gun's in the oven. It has nothing to do with good therapy. Like, but if a lot of people I could imagine are trying to use they're trying to combine forward motion in the plot with also accurate therapy. And that's so hard to do. If you don't get it right, don't feel bad.
I appreciate that. So to go back, to make sure I understood you clearly, there isn't an actual license for a counselor, therapist, psychologist to work with children, although you can specialize in it. Is that correct?
There's not actually a thing that I know of in the United States.
All right. So what about addictions? That's something that shows up in fiction a lot, and it shows up a lot in our day-to-day lives. Do you have to be specially licensed for that?
That depends on the state. And in most states in the United States, yes, you do. You have to have a certification to do that. So again, it's different than some places you are a licensed addictions counselor or something like that. But most places that I've heard of in the United States, you have to be, I think in Washington State, it's like a chemical dependency. It's like a CPD or CDP, which somewhere in there is chemical dependency. And right, like if you have that cert, then places will hire you so that way you can work with addictions.
Okay.
Right. And if you don't have that, then you might be considered practicing outside of scope.
Okay, so what if I have a character who's having marital problems and addictions are part of that? Do they need to see two different counselors? Like maybe one who's a marriage and family counselor and an addiction counselor, or would they be able to see one person?
In most situations, so for the relationship stuff, are they seeing the professional with their partner?
Yes.
Okay, so then yes, you would have, because again, the couples therapy is going to be different. When you're working with couples or families, the couple or the family is generally considered to be the client or the patient.
So collectively, they're the client or patient.
Yeah.
Okay.
For insurance purposes, you regularly have to identify, oh, that's the identified patient. And that's a term they use in family services, where it's like, oh, this is the person that it seems that problems are originating around. But like, again, a family therapist might see, oh yeah, so little Susie there, they're the ones that are having explosive outrages and breaking stuff. But they might start with the mom and dad who are having their own things that are contributing to what's going on with Susie. And that's going to be different than like if, say, dad in that scenario has addiction, that he is needing additional support, that working with the family is not just cutting it for addressing his addiction challenges. So he's going to have his own provider, therapist, counselor, who's going to work specifically on his issues, likely the addiction, because we tend to highlight that if that's present.
Okay. I feel like we've gotten a pretty good concept of like the layout. And we actually went into way more detail, and I'm glad we brought in those other things I didn't expect. So let's dive into us as writers.
Okay.
So I'm going to explain a little bit to set this up for you and for everyone listening. In the sphere of author communities, there's this, it's a joke and it's not a joke. We like to say that the first book we write is often like therapy, or even better than therapy. Because we learn a lot about ourselves, and letting anybody read our very first book is like letting them inside our heads, maybe more than we want to let anybody in. Sure. That's why some of us may or may not publish our first book, because it's a little too real and a little bit too close to us.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And one of the things that happens in these first books, and one of the reasons that a lot of authors find themselves unable to complete their first books, is that we end up writing about the hardest topics in our lives. The hardest things that we haven't managed to wrestle with, the things that left scars in us, the things that gave us handicaps or complexes or PTSD, whether or not it's diagnosed. And we can find ourselves just stuck. We're sitting there, we're trying to finish, we're trying to write. And in many cases, people I've talked to, even myself on occasion, we don't realize, especially in our first book, I would say especially in our first 5, but especially in the first book we're writing as adults, we don't realize we can feel like we're lazy, we can feel like we're stuck, we're feeling like we can't move forward. But oftentimes it's because we're dealing with these issues that are just so big. Right. So I just want to, right off the bat, as we started talking about, is acknowledge that writing, what we're trying to write, can be affected by our mental health. And that when we choose to dive into these deep, dark places in our heads, our own mental health issues can show up. Absolutely. And we can start to see new mental health challenges. And I don't think we talk about enough in the writing community the fact that our lives outside of writing can be affected by what we're writing.
Wow, that sounds preposterous. Why would anybody? I can't even.
Everything's an exchange. It goes back and forth. So maybe we can start, because this is a whole big thing I've just handed you, but maybe we could start by just discussing some tools that we as writers can use, maybe some things we can be aware of to realize when this is what's happening versus us just being lazy or not wanting to write. Sure. Those are usually covers for something else going on. Yeah. So as I see the world, I tend to ground things. My biggest umbrella would make Rihanna jealous is compassion work, right? So compassion, it in therapy, we borrowed a fair amount of things from Eastern cultures, so anybody that knows dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT, was founded by somebody with severe mental health challenges who spent time in a Buddhist monastery and
learned how to channel some of those things and turned it into a theory of treatment and psychological behavior, etc. But as somebody that uses compassion, I tend to keep an ear out for where's the judgment? Where's the blame? Is there shame that's here? Right. And I will caution people that under the wrong circumstances and the wrong frame of mind, those questions can be very dangerous and daunting, or feel very dangerous and daunting, right? Like if I feel like shit and I'm like, hey, where's the shame? Right? Like that's that. If I'm not ready, if I haven't done some work beforehand, if I haven't practiced this when I'm feeling a bit more clear-headed, I could be inviting in like, oh, here's the shame, avalanche. And
the
so like
spigot all over our heads, all over what we're trying to do.
Yeah, right. So what I would say is, generally speaking, we want to have some go-to preparation that happens before we're in that place, especially if you're using tools, right? Tools are something that have to be practiced for them to be useful, particularly when you don't need them or when it feels like you're not reaching for them. If you only practice them when you're reaching for them, they're not going to be as effective. So for me, I would encourage folk to be aware when they're feeling calm and grounded, or just their baselines. I don't want to put that on anybody that you're supposed to be one way or another when you're going about life. But when you're at your baseline, just get used to asking, oh, am I noticing some judgment here? Am I noticing blame here? And just treat it like you're doing science, right? Like, yes, no. It doesn't have to be, oh, I'm noticing some judgment. I must be a shit person. Like, okay, now that's more judgment. And now you're going to get yourself into this big circle, right? So it's, oh, there's some judgment. Okay, I noticed that.
So if I might frame this in terms of like judgment that might show up for a writer, I'm just sitting there, I'm trying to write, the words aren't coming, and a refrain that I've experienced that other writers who talk to me experience is like, why am I even doing this? I'm such a shit person. I can't write. Would that be judgment?
Yeah. And you can tell judgment by a few things, one of which is the emotional weight of what you're saying. Right. I think a lot of us have met somebody or somebody that's been in a place where they've been like, well, I'm just shit and that's it. Yeah. And they like try and downplay it, but like you still hear that there's weight there.
They still care. They're just pretending they don't.
Sure, maybe. I'm not even saying that. I'm just saying if we take a step back, and I'm guessing a lot of your listeners have been in a place where they've heard somebody, or maybe they've heard themselves say that. And I'm making a joke. I'm not trying to make light of anybody's experiences. I've been in places where I've said things like that myself. But being able to just hear that and go, oh, there's a little bit of weight there, right? Like something that I've shared with a client before is like, we were having a similar discussion to say, if I say, oh, I'll never fly again, right? Like I'll never fly. Like I don't have wings. I can't fly. Right? Like that's factually true, but what's the weight of that? The way that I'm saying it, there's clearly something beyond the actual words that I'm saying.
I mean, I'm feeling it in my body, and I'm not even saying it about myself right now. I'm just hearing you say it about a hypothetical person.
Right. Yeah. So, and that's the other piece too, is checking in with your physical being, right? So taking a moment, oh, I'm noticing there might be some judgment here. Does that show up in my body? Am I noticing tension in my shoulders, or is my posture slumping in? Do I feel like my energy is starting to spike? Do I feel like my energy is dropping and I'm like going to disconnect here or go take a nap or dissociate? Those are all good signs, and we want to get good at practicing them before we need them, especially if you're going to go into a book that's going to take your own history, your own traumatic experiences, your own just struggles and trials and tribulations in life. You want to have that before, if you can, or at least you want to practice it away from the page.
So practice it on something maybe less heavy than the book you're writing, so that when you're writing it, those resources, those tools are available to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you can even do it before, like you sit down to write, take some breaths, check in with your body. Think about the task in front of you. How does your body respond? Do parts of you show up and go, ew, writing? Do parts of you show up like, yeah, I got to do this. I'm going to crush it. Yeah. Like, just notice them. Start by that. And the more that you're able to notice and just have a sense that it's there, the more in tune you will be. And then the other thing too is like, you want to draw on this stuff in your work, right? Like, you don't want it to be written by an emotionless robot, I'm guessing.
So any of these tools, any of these awarenesses can actually feed into our work because we'll be aware of when our characters might be feeling things.
Yes, but what I mean is you want to be able to tap into that at a distance. So where I was going with that is if you practice noticing it when you need it, it won't take over your whole being necessarily. I think there's this misunderstanding that for an emotion to be translated, it just has to consume you. Well, there's some pretty intense stuff that we can tap into, and we can do it by noticing that it's there, by stepping outside of ourselves and going, oh yeah, that's some serious sadness right there. And then we have better control then of what we're able to do with that sadness. Because if I tap too much into that sadness, it's going to burn me out. Or maybe I just get so sad I can't even write anymore. I can't make good decisions about my plot or what my character would do next.
We're just wrapped up inside of it to the point. Yeah. As a writer, I'm thinking, okay, these distances are almost like different POVs when I'm writing. Like there's a first person POV where you're entirely enwrapped and you only experience what that character's experiencing. It's all consuming. And then there's like a third person POV where you're like watching what is happening. There's other POVs in the middle, like third person limited, which is done in third person, but still more encompassing the one character, but still a little bit more distance than, say, first person, all encompassing. Mm-hmm. But yeah, those are really good things to do. I know that myself as a writer, sometimes I'll have all encompassing emotions before I start, but I can also, in the middle of the writing session, become entirely consumed by what I'm writing about, to the point that I am unaware of everything else.
Right. So in an instance like that, sorry to interrupt you, in an instance like that, it's a good thing. It might be a good thing to have checked in before, right? Because then you've practiced. I know that you've practiced this sort of thing before. You're able to notice when you do, right? Eventually you get to a place where you're like, oh, I'm here. And then you're able to check back in. You're able to ground yourself, take a moment, see if the decisions that you made while you were in that state make sense for the page, or if they don't.
I mean, for me, a really good barometer is how high are my shoulders? Are they way up by my ears? They like halfway down, or are they relaxed? Mm-hmm. It's taken me a while to like when I sit down at my desk now, I like check where my shoulders are, which is actually a physical thing, because if I'm too stressed out and my shoulders are too high, eventually my hand has all this nerve pain and I'm not going to be writing anyway. That's a problem.
I love when mental health gets super practical.
I have to use my hands.
You do. I hope for you more use of your hands.
And hands are actually a big issue for a lot of writers, is we don't take care of them early on and we hit our 30s, 40s. And I don't know, because I'm not a medical doctor, how much the tension in the shoulders or the emotional tension translates, but a lot of us do end up with hand injuries related to nerves.
I believe it. And shoulders is a common place to carry and store tension. One of my main spots is in my left shoulder blade, which then pulls my shoulder, which then pulls my neck, which sometimes then pulls my ear muscles in my head and all that good stuff.
So what I'm hearing is we have really good physical reasons to take care of our mental health.
Absolutely. And I'm not just telling you that so you go out and buy more therapy.
All right, so let me make sure that we covered everything that you wanted to share, because I did cut you off at one point. So when we're working, recognizing emotional distress in ourselves, checking in beforehand, checking to see if we have any judgment, kind of scanning our bodies, practicing this before we're working in the work session. Mm-hmm. Did we cover everything?
Yeah. Another useful thing that I'll give your listeners is just coming up with your own subjective 1 to 10 scale. And when I say come up with, I don't mean like write it out and have a plan, unless that works for you. but just having a sense of like, am I at, in terms of my level of emotion or stress or discomfort, am I at a 1 where everything feels like, yeah, it's good, I'm great, this is fantastic, or I'm at a 10 where like shit has gotten really real, I'm in a really bad place, and that probably needs to be addressed almost immediately.
And
And
when
you could
you
use that as a way to check in of, oh, when I get to a 7, that's when I make shit decisions about my story, right? Or when I'm at an 8, like I notice the next day I just really struggle. Or right. So getting to know where it is that you're at in the process, what you're feeling along the way, so you can shoot for something different using whatever techniques or tools you have.
I like that. So let's go back to another thing I mentioned when I first brought this idea in of writing our first book, or it might not even be our first book, but a lot of us first come across this in our first book, or when we decide to write our opus memoir, whatever, is revisiting painful memories. Because when we're writing characters, most of our characters have a piece of us inside of them. And in story, there's always a problem, there's always a pain, there's always a wound, especially in our main characters, and then the story is about that. So we often take these very painful pieces of ourselves or people we've met, things we've heard, experienced, and give them to our characters, like these little or very big gifts that cost us to write. And sometimes it can be healing to do it. Healing can also cost, at least in terms of emotional fatigue.
Sure.
So it can be empowering, but sometimes it can also creep up on us. So are there ways to like engage with turning these memories into art? Like a barometer, like I'm asking a very specific, and this might go beyond the scope of what you're comfortable saying, but are there ways to turn these very painful memories into art, to come to love the process, to accept it, that aren't just re-injuring ourselves over and over again?
Yeah. And I say that some of that question is far more philosophical and from an art standpoint than it is a mental health standpoint. So I'll speak mostly to the mental health side of things. Research is pretty clear that when we get to a certain point, we get to a certain threshold of distress, the body says enough is enough. The brain does not function as it's optimally supposed to. And in that instance, the best thing that can come from that, and I mean that as a threshold, as a limit, the best thing you can hope for in that instance is that your art comes out really good, because you are likely going to have repercussions for that experience, whether that's just feeling like shit, whether that's increase in symptoms, right? And that being said, it's not always, for most of us, we can't create great art when we're just entirely consumed with our emotional pain and trauma response. The parts of the brain that tend to be more creative tend to shut down when we reach a certain level of stress in the body, right? So for most people, unless you're one of probably a couple billion, being able to use what tools you have, having that scale of like, yeah, I make good art when I'm at a 7 or a 6 or 3, and learning for yourself where that's at, so you can find the balance of what feels good and what's healing, as opposed to, yeah, I just re-traumatized myself so I can have a bitchin' story.
I feel like some people actually choose that route, re-traumatizing themselves to create art.
I mean, to be fair, there is there's a lot of evidence to suggest that depending on the person and their age and how their trauma showed up and how it shows up again, trauma tends to be cyclical, right? And so there is an element of being drawn to relive or to experience what we call re-traumatizing, and one of the names for it in practice, because there's a certain energy that's with it, right? So maybe I feel really down and dissociated, except for when I'm in a drama, right? Like I'm beefing with somebody. And then all of a sudden, my stress system swings the other way. And now I'm in that place of traumatization or re-traumatization. But for once, I'm getting shit done. I'm like, I feel like I can do something. So maybe a part of me learns that, I have to have something going on that kicks me into that state because that's better than the alternative. Just to give one of many examples of how that could show up. So I believe that when people are at that place where, and I don't mean to pass a judgment upon those people. If that's what a person and their parts of themselves are needing and feeling like they need, then that's going to be that's what they're able to do. I would also encourage that person to seek good trauma-informed services, so that way they can maybe find some different things, some different change there, that they can engage with their story in a way that doesn't become re-traumatizing, right? And maybe find that it's possible to feel good other ways, or to write good story without being lost in it.
I know that myself and other artists, and not just talking about writing, although I'm still talking about writing fiction, I had a fear that if I healed from certain traumas, that my writing would suffer, that I wouldn't be able to bring that authenticity and intensity. And we are having thunder outside, so I hope it doesn't mess up the podcast too much.
Ooh, south weather.
Yes. So when I'm writing, I was worried at a point in time that if I lost that trauma, like that was what I was worried. If I lose this trauma, I'll lose my identity. I won't be the writer that I used to be. And what part of what happened is I was like, well, I really, really have to heal. So I did continue to seek healing for traumas, and I continue to do that to this day. What I found actually happened, and I'm going to share this because I think there's probably someone out here who needs to hear it, is you don't forget the trauma. You don't lose it. You don't no longer know what it felt like so that you can communicate it on the page. But you have more ability to see around it, which actually allowed me to create plots around some of these traumas and some of these situations without losing it. Because I'd sit there and I'd write about this particular thing. For example, religious trauma is a big one for me. And I would just get wrapped up in the memories and the experiences. But once I had managed to deal with that in therapy, in shadow work, etc., I was able to write more objectively without losing any of the complexity of the actual experience. But that took a few years.
Yeah, I'm sure it did. And the way that we conceptualize trauma, which most of it's informed by exhaustive trauma research, I believe the psychological field has something like 60,000 peer-reviewed published articles a year on trauma. And that's been going on for decades, right? We have no shortage of literature on trauma. And a lot of it's based on observation. It's not like what tends to happen with psychology. Unfortunately, we start with some assumptions and then we try to jerry-rig that and shoehorn that into what we're seeing. This is the other way around. We started with what they call the phenomenological research. What do we see? What happens? And then use that to construct ways of treating it. And so in those theories, they talk about healing trauma as integrating, right? The language is very specific, even though it's jargony, because there's this observed thing that happens where trauma doesn't get remembered the same way. It's kind of disjointed, to oversimplify it. It gets remembered in a way that's not really connected. And part of that theorized because the front of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, frontal lobe, some of that doesn't get as much activity. And those are the places where we understand time, chronology, language, right? So yeah, if you have this memory that brings your brain into a state where your whole brain's not working, right, then it's not going to be integrated. You're not going to be able to see it as a part of your life the way that you see, like, oh yeah, there was that one time I went to that birthday party, or this time I met so-and-so and we have a great friendship. It's going to be disconnected. And so by healing that, you integrate those memories into yourself, your timeline, in a way that's helpful. And so you can draw on them more objectively and see things more deeply.
This is interesting to me because when I was writing a particular book, there were some scenes with extremely strong emotions having to do with a particular kind of trauma, religious trauma, exactly. And I could write them in isolation, but I couldn't place them in the greater plot. And what
Mm.
I ended up doing to be able to finish this book is I allowed myself to write really messy scenes when I was in a very highly elevated state. And to be honest, I threw most of them away, but I felt it was necessary to get it out there. Like the act of writing it out, as messy as it was, as out of character as some of my characters ended up being, I just let it flow until I felt like I could breathe around it.
Hmm.
And then I went back and I plotted the story. I got the arcs right. I got the foreshadowing right. I did all of that. But I walked away from the desk and at different times in those elevated states, whatever I needed to bring to that story, I wrote isolated scenes. And then I would walk away after writing those isolated scenes and edit later, like some cases 6 months later, to get away from it. And those scenes are some of the best scenes in the book, but they were written in isolation because I could not integrate the intense emotion of my own trauma showing up in those scenes with writing a cohesive plot. I had to separate different parts of my brain. And what you just said about activating different parts of the brain, that makes more sense to me now, because there were certain things I just could not think about while experiencing this, but it made for a good scene.
Yeah. Yeah. So I can't help but wonder, with that experience, do you feel like your relationship to what ended up in those scenes, and those sort of traumas that you referenced, do you feel like your relationship to them changed?
I did, because one of the reasons that so many writers find fiction healing is I got to fight back in these scenes with a level of rage and intensity via characters who had power to express their rage that I never had when I experienced those moments. So I
Mhm.
brought in a character that I had made that had power, gave
Wow.
them power, woke them up, and then I fought those battles over and over again every time I wrote the scene. And in my own life, I've found that translated to more power for myself because I've practiced fighting that trauma over and over again in my fiction to the point that it's translated to real life.
Wow. That's quite a process.
It is. It took several years. And this is one of the reasons I do believe that fiction is healing both for the reader and the writer if we can be conscious about it. And sometimes even if we aren't conscious, because I'll be honest, when I started writing this particular book, I was not terribly conscious about therapy or even open to therapy.
Sure. Sure.
But
Yeah.
in the course of it, I did. And therapy definitely helped.
There may be therapists out there who would be super down to help you apply your process in a way that's therapeutic. Right. So that doesn't mean they're going to come in and be like, well, really, this character should be in this chapter over here doing this. It's more like something that's really important in the therapy process is fit. So that can be something that, if anybody out there is seeking therapy, that can be a part of what you're looking for when you're looking for a good fit. Is this person gonna feel really weird and like, oh, I don't know what to do, the client's talking about their book as a trauma thing, I guess I'll just listen? Or are they going to be open and be like, yeah, that's great, like I actually have some things we could do around that, I want to know more about that, and here's how I, being able to express, here's how I think that what I have to offer you could fit into your process. And here's what I think, maybe even saying, yeah, I have some concerns about XYZ. Tell me more about them so I can better understand if there's anything that we need to do to help make that a good process.
I like all of that. And I've actually vetted my own therapist by like bringing, you have to talk to each of your therapists about it. But I have brought some of my writing into therapy spaces to discuss them and found it to be helpful. And in some cases, my therapist like just stared at me for a while and like reached for words, but it actually did always turn out really well. I would never expect my therapist to read a 230,000 word novel to understand me. That's
Right.
unreasonable, but discussing it at least. Have you reached that sweet place where you've written out your entire story? It's a wonderful feeling. You've worked so hard for this, spent so many long hours at the keyboard or talking to yourself via recorder, then going over it again at the computer. It's been mostly internal work, and it's often been alone. But now, it's time to take it from rough to polished, and for that, outside perspective is essential. Let me help you. As a developmental editor, I, Bethany A. Tucker, will take your hand,
sort through your draft, answer your questions, and help you polish it until your work shines. You don't have to do this alone. It doesn't matter if this is your first book or your 10th book, whether you've published this book already and want to make it better, or you're teetering on the edge, eager to publish for the first time. Together, we can take your book to the next level. Contact me via links in the show notes or at theartandscienceofwords@gmail.com to take the next step.
Let's look at navigating generational trauma as we're writing. I know that myself, I had some really strong themes in like the first 9 years of my fiction that I didn't even realize until I got a little bit older and looked back, and I was like, you're obsessed with this one kind of relationship. It keeps showing up in your writing, and this other relationship doesn't exist at all. Like, and you'll even see this with like fairy tales in some genres where like the mother's always dead and the child's an orphan, or they have a bad relationship with their dad. Different writers, different genres have these kind of tropes, but it's actually a reflection of stuff going on. There's two ways. I have it in my bullet points. It's like, talk about navigating generational trauma. I would say writing generational trauma, and then, and we might talk about this more later in detail, but I'll just mention it here, dealing with the fact that you are writing about your generational trauma when people in your family are still alive.
Yeah, that's thorny right there. So I'd say that the general practices that were described earlier, right? Knowing what number out of 10 that you're at, getting to know your process and how that impacts your body, your emotions, your thoughts, just become curious about those things applies here, because the systems in the body and the ways that our brains and minds tend to interact with intergenerational trauma tend to view it still as trauma. And there's also opportunities to practice compassion, meaning, and in this case, I'm using it very specifically, of the boundary of experience. Yeah, so this is a thing that I have been given from somebody else. There can be power in naming that and knowing that I'm having a reaction to this thing that was given to me. And maybe there are expectations around the people that gave it to me. And those expectations are theirs. And I can draw kind of a line in my head of where that experience ends and mine begins. And maybe there's interactions between those experiences, right? You don't have to get super deep. You just notice what here is mine. And by mine, I don't mean like what you're responsible for. It's just like, what experience is yours, and what experience feels like it's yours, and what experience is the people that done gave you the trauma.
Sometimes it's not even that these people hurt us, it's that they have their own trauma from people who hurt them, and they've passed on those experiences, those expectations. When I'm writing, I often think of it as like everyone in my family tree, everyone in my academic family tree or my writing family tree, because I like have people who have affected me in all these different areas, but everyone in my family tree handing me these carpet bags, these big suitcases. And I'm like, okay, I'm here at the bottom of this heritage chart. I've got all these suitcases and I'm juggling them. And some people are like, yeah, I want you to never forget this. And, you've got to always be grateful for this. And I worked so hard for you. And then here's me as a writer in the number one thing that I found. And I know other people might have other issues, but these are the most common, the ones that I can speak to, is guilt and rage. Guilt that I'm writing about something that I know some people might never want me to admit I experienced, or being like, a question that happened to me a lot when I was a young teenager is adults in my life would read my work and they would be like, how do you know this? We've protected you. We've kept you safe. You should never have experienced this. How do you know this experience exists or this emotion exists? I had no answers for these people. But the two things that happened was I recognized guilt and rage in them, and then at some point in myself, because I had guilt for writing about certain things or not writing about other things that were in these bags that my heritage had given me, or rage that I felt these expectations or that they had happened, or secondhand rage where I was feeling rage at a people group that never did anything to me directly, but my heritage had given me this rage.
We can tie it back to that compassion piece of where's the boundary, right? Whose suffering is this? Where is my suffering? Where is your suffering, right? And I get to choose in what ways I engage with that suffering. Maybe I choose to engage with my suffering by writing a book, right? Maybe I offer softness and gentleness to my own suffering. And if anyone's interested, there's a lot of stuff out there about compassion and compassion-focused therapy and how compassion is a protective force, et cetera. But the other piece that I find really comes up for me here is from Juanita Robertson, who is not a classical mental health person, but is actually a community person and a spiritual person. I think the title she considers herself as elder is the one that resonates with her most. And she is very well read. And so I'm going to quote her as she quotes a bunch of other people, so I don't have to quote them. But she talks about rage being inherently communal, right? And to butcher her wise words, there's a difference between what we feel internal, that's just an individual element of anger, and then the rage that is more communal, that happens in the face of what's going on around us, right? And something that I find really the most important of what she's saying, what she says around this is she looks at shame, blame, and guilt as not emotions, but things that protect us from the emotion.
Interesting. Okay.
So to put that into context, if I notice that there's blame and I'm like, and I mean, people have probably gotten a sense I've been a little loose and off the cuff on this interview and podcast so far. I definitely have parts of me that carry some judgment. I also come from, I'm Black and I come from some of the Black culture that has a way of speaking and navigating that carries some inherent judgment in it. And so just to own that as I talk about, like, maybe I'm like, oh yeah, this motherfucker over here, right? And now, like, if I'm just navigating life, maybe I don't take a moment and be like, why did I say this motherfucker over here, right? Like, where was I at when I said that? But if I do take a moment and go, yeah, when I said that, and I was feeling something there. Yeah, I was definitely blaming that motherfucker, right? Like, that person is receiving my blame. And I can pause and check in with myself if it feels important enough for me, or I'm committed enough to this practice to go, okay, there's blame here. Is there grief under this? Because that's something that Juanita will often reference is underneath these things. It tends to be grief, right?
Layers under layers.
Yeah, well, and it doesn't have to be super deep. It's just there's blame, and under blame is likely an emotion, and it's usually some grief attached to it, right? Like, maybe I'm mad at this motherfucker over here, as I called him, because he said something to me that hit upon an old memory that hurt me, and I still have grief that's there, right? And so I can know that, and that can inform how I navigate the reactions of others, and I can see that they're having their grief, and I can see what is shared in this grief. Like, you're talking about the carpet bags of people. How do you know this? Right? We try to protect you from this. They're having their grief, and it's not bad that they have it. If they get to choose what to do with that now, if they want to stay in blame of blaming you or blaming the world for you having that emotion, that's up to them. And they get to make that decision. And then I'm bringing back to my compassion thing. They get to make that decision on their own, and we can engage with them in how they make or don't make that decision. But we ultimately get to boundary off what is my experience, what is your experience, and it allows us to consciously make decisions of how we show up and what we do with it.
One of the gates, I think of it as, that I had to go through to fully develop as an author was to stop writing with my ancestors looking over my shoulder. I had to stop thinking about them when I was writing and just write. And then when I got to the publishing stage, not the editing, I still had to edit without them there, because that would mess up my art. But when I got to the publishing stage, I'd be like, so am I gonna tell so and so that this book is out? Maybe I should just tell so and so this isn't for you, and allow them to be the owners of their reactions to my work.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that that's in alignment with how I tend to see these scenarios, right? Where there is a lot of grief and emotion and a lot of expectation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you've mentioned modalities a couple of times. I know that when I'm writing, I've had to like research these things, like what am I going to say? I want to get it right. And then just I just think it would be good for authors to have a little bit more idea about this term modality.
There's modalities, there's theory, there's approaches. For your listeners' purposes, it's probably all just the same, right? Like a modality or an approach, maybe you link that together. A theory is a set of ideas that guides our understanding of people, which therefore guides our understanding of their problems, which therefore guides our understanding of how to treat them, right? So I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of folk out there hadn't heard of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. It is a well-known modality. It sits right at historically, it sat right at that intersection of like simple enough, so we kind of get it on its face, sciencey enough that we believe it because science be good, yo, and but also accessible, right? So there's for a theory or an approach to be used a lot, it has to capture a lot of traits, and CBT did one. The idea of CBT is that it has its roots philosophically in Stoicism. There's different iterations of it, but that we have thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And if you want to change a behavior, you have to change a feeling. And if you want to change a feeling, you have to change a thought. And there's lots of techniques that are designed to do that. It has a lot of prevalence. Like I was looking into PhD programs earlier today and found that like when still to this day, when people say evidence-based, they're almost always referring to CBT. Let's not forget that there's a database of evidence-based practices that you have to register and show burden of proof that, yes, this is supported by evidence, and it has thousands of things. No, CBT, that's the only thing that's evidence-based. I'm guessing,
CBT
go ahead.
is probably the most popular modality that I've seen authors in the last year or two of my reading reference for their characters, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, I know I'm kind of shitting on it as a joke. I shit more on where it sits in society than its actual usefulness these days, because it is useful and it is very easy to understand, at least from a top-down level. It tends to, I view it as slightly incomplete unless you add other components to it, which more updated versions of it have, like such as adding mindfulness or dialectical behavioral therapy, which I mentioned earlier, is considered third wave behavioralism or third wave CBT, so to speak. And that
dialectical behavior therapy, is that what you call DBT?
Yeah, dialectical behavioral therapy. And it's based off of, that's the one that comes from a lot of Buddhist perspective. It's based on the dialectic of acceptance and change and how they seem like they're at odds with each other, but really they're not. Like we have to have both acceptance and change, and getting comfortable with that discomfort of like, oh, these things don't feel like they go together, but they do. And there's a lot of in DBT that's like mindfully notice, right? So observe and describe your environment, increase your ability to tolerate distress. So that way you're either more effective in your ability to change or to seek change, or you're more able to accept what's happening, is what it's usually associated with.
So as I'm writing, if I have a character, I'm going to give you examples instead of asking you to theorize. Okay. Say I have a character with a lot of anxiety. Mm-hmm. Would I, and I intend for them to be successful in their therapy as part of their character arc, mm-hmm. would I have them engage with a CBT therapist?
I mean, it depends how deep you want to go as the writer and how central the therapy is. So if you want just like two-dimensional therapy in your story and it's just there because it serves some purpose that makes sense to your story, then you don't even have to say what it is they do. You don't even have to describe it. But the more that it shows up on the page, the more it will become clear to someone like myself, or even just to a reader that's kind of reading it going, that the author is or is not connected to what they're trying to describe. Okay. So can I say that a little differently?
Go ahead.
So to bring it back to your example, if somebody wants a character that has anxiety and they overcome that anxiety and they want therapy to be an important part of that, but like, it's just the fact that they keep doing it and that they struggle to get there and that some days they don't think about going, that they go anyway. And maybe they even describe a scene where it's not like a good session. You probably don't need a deep understanding of any modality to put that on the page, right? Because I've had days where it's not quite clicking with folk and you just do what you can. And that's okay, because not every day is going to be perfect. And so maybe I'm not doing the work that we set out to do or had hoped to do, because that's not what's accessible. And we're just going to be human to human and talk for a bit. But if you want them to have this really, like maybe they have a high level of anxiety, or you want that to be central to your story, and you want to send them to a therapist that's believable, that kind of makes sense, and you choose CBT, you're as an author, you're going to want to know a little bit about how that works. What are the techniques that are used there? And yes, anxiety is, basically most approaches or theories can be applied to most problems. There's some very specific ones, like EMDR is mostly framed as a trauma intervention, which it is. So like maybe somebody wouldn't do EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprogramming therapy. They wouldn't do that if they're like, yeah, I'm having trouble sleeping. And it's like, well, do you have trauma? No, I just watch a lot of Netflix. Like that might not be an appropriate fit. But like, even still, if you really wanted to, you could. You just want to know that like, yeah, that's not normal. Like EMDR is not usually reserved for that.
Yeah. No, I've done EMDR. And yeah, as it's always been explained to me, it's very much you're working through trauma.
Mm-hmm. That's what it was designed for and how it's commonly employed. I want to give some, since I talked a lot about like a small handful of ones, I want to give some other names and things to folk.
Please go for it.
So the main thing that most people could easily describe is what they call person-centered therapy, also called Rogerian, named after Carl Rogers, who basically had the breakthrough that like, maybe we don't have to be super deep in psychoanalysis, or maybe we don't have to force somebody to change their behavior. Maybe we just show up as a person and expect that they're the expert of their experience and treat them with unconditional positive regard and reflect back to them the things that they say to us. And that maybe that in and of itself is good enough for treatment. And the thing is even if nowadays, even if you don't see somebody who considers themselves a person-centered therapist, chances are they're going to incorporate those ideas into what they do. Because we found that like Carl Rogers was fucking right. Like it's really hard to be an asshole therapist who's also successful these days. So that's one that I would offer folk as person-centered therapy. There's also there's also just to touch on it, because I know that people have a lot of questions. There's psychoanalytic theory, which is it's not one theory, it's a school of many theories attributed first to Freud, but also includes people like Carl Jung, in some cases, Fitz Perls, who did Gestalt therapy. And these therapies are all about going really deep. It's about things that are non-conscious. They'll either, depending on the theory, use subconscious or unconscious or both. They tend to take a lot longer. Jungians tend to look at dreams more so than anything else, depending. Gestalt people tend to try and finish unfinished business and get really creative. They do the empty chair, where you talk to a chair, imagining that a person that you need to talk to is sitting in it. And then on the other side of the spectrum, classically, there's behavioral. Okay. And that first started with, well, we couldn't ever possibly measure thought or emotions. We can only measure behavior because science. And that's where behavioralism historically. I'm
trying so hard not to laugh when you say that.
Yeah. I mean, that's why I say it, is because it's laughably a joke. That was the perspective of the time, and it's super dismissive. But it had its breakthroughs, and it has its place. For somebody that is not motivated and is like court mandated, behavioral therapy is one of the few things that makes sense, right? Because I don't have to have a great relationship with somebody that doesn't want a relationship with me. If all I'm trying to do is get them to see their PO or stop drinking, parole officer, excuse me, stop drinking, right? Like get their anger under control. If I'm just trying to get them to reach specific benchmarks and there's limited time, and they're not going to like me given the nature of the circumstances, or maybe they have a certain personality type, then behavioral can be useful there, because I just focus on, hey, I'm going to let the rough edges roll off me. I'm just going to ask, how much did you drink today? Right? Like, I'm going to say, what do we need to do to get you to see a parole officer? Right? Like,
very much focused on the behavior itself.
Yeah, which also can be similar to what they call solutions-focused therapy, which is non-directive, where I just walk a person through, what are your problems with this? How would you address them? Classic solutions-focused, I do very little input. I just ask you the questions and you figure out how to solve your problem. That tends to not always work in practice, because sometimes you ask the right questions, people go, oh. And so then, as a therapist, I'm not going to sit there in silence and go, yeah, well, let me ask that again. I'm going to be like, well, okay, well, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? And then once the juices get flowing, a person might latch on to, oh yeah, that's a great idea. I've had this idea. What if we do it this way? Let's try it. Great. Let's talk about it when I see you next. And then, did it work? Did it not? What hurdles did you have? What was the experience? What do we need to change?
So in this case, the therapist is really the conduit for the person discovering their own solutions inside of themselves they may not have done on their own.
Yeah, solutions focus tends to be more, it doesn't go deep. It tends to be more behavioral-ish in its presentation. I'm not an expert on it. I rarely use it. So if you're interested, learn more and be critical of my words with a discerning eye or ear. But it is a lot about helping people navigate decision-making process and finding solutions that they then are responsible for. Why? Because they came up with it, right? And then they do it or they don't.
Okay. So were there any other modalities before we should go into like what's trauma-informed therapy and buzzword therapy? Because I know those were two things we wanted to cover.
Yeah, I would be remiss if I didn't mention narrative therapy to a bunch of authors.
Yes, I want to hear about this.
So narrative therapy is relatively new-ish compared to a lot of the other modalities. And narrative therapy is the idea, it's postmodern, meaning that it's constructed together. We create reality between us. And in this instance, us meaning therapist and client. And narrative therapy, it's not necessarily like, oh, we're going to write a story out this bitch. It's more like, oh, we're going to take what's going on with you and we're going to make that a character in your story, so to speak. Not like literally, but more like, okay, so I'm feeling depressed. Therapist says, okay, so there's depression in your life, right? Well, what's the story around that depression? How does that depression stop you, right? And as an author, I'm sure you're picking up on what I'm doing. I'm framing that in terms of the story of this thing. It is no longer this thing that you're grappling with inside you that is you. I've now made this an antagonist in your story.
We've externalized it, which allows us to see it, work with it. It becomes a character in our life that we can now interact with instead of just suffer from.
Yeah. And it's funny, externalizing is the language they use. I was trying not to get too jargony, but that's exactly how narrative therapy has been explained to me.
I mean, that's something that we have to do as authors, is sometimes we say, this is actually jargon inside my world, is we're too close to the story. We're too close to our characters to actually write them. So we do actually have to project them away from ourselves a little bit and try to let them to be themselves so that we can actually write them instead of just writing a whole bunch of characters out of ourselves or just getting stuck.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's very similar to that. It gives some shape to it. There's also somatic-based therapies, one of the modalities that I use. I have a little bit of training in sensory motor therapy. And the idea is that the body is connected to the thoughts and emotions. They're all connected, right? You can't, like, if you all of a sudden had a good feeling, just euphoria hit you, you would instinctively have a body reaction. You would instinctively make meaning of it and have thoughts around it. And there's likely an emotion or an emotional complexity to that euphoria besides euphoria, whether that's happiness, joy, excitement, whatever. So especially with trauma shows up so much in the body through the fight flight system, the sympathetic nervous system, et cetera, that if we get so focused in on the thoughts and the emotions, we're only on a small piece of that circle. And in fact, we're at the hardest to enter, because I start talking about a trauma and all of a sudden now I'm in it.
Mm-hmm.
But instead, somatic therapies are what they call bottom up. So cognitive behavioral therapy is top down. I start at the head and I work my way down: thoughts, emotions, body. If that CBT regularly doesn't use the body. Somatic therapies are body up: body, emotions, thoughts, or some middle out version of that, right? There are some middle out therapies too. So if I can help a person to get connected with their body, become more attuned to what's happening, understand that it's okay that you're having sensations that maybe you can't put into English, like that's normal. Bodies are supposed to have sensations. We have butterflies. We have shortness of breath. We have senses of constriction. Sometimes we have warmth or cool in places. Right? These are all normal, even if we don't have a logical explanation. The body has a wisdom of its own that we tap into by connecting and building a relationship with the body. And then eventually, through several steps, we bring in a trauma narrative that we slowly process through the body. So start with the story, body reacts, drop the story, let the body process. And then the body does its thing. We do the thing with the body, which I would never say out loud in a grocery store in public with no context. But, and then we bring the story back in, and then we keep doing that until the memory or the experience is processed. So that's kind of one way that somatic interventions can show up.
As a writer, what this is making me think of is the fact that, so I coach people to write their books. I also do a lot of editing, and something that I keep having to tell my writers is that you need to get inside your character's body, especially if it's a limited POV. Get inside your character's body, because you can say the word forever, but if you can communicate to your reader like it's their body having the reaction, now you have a really big impact. It's so much, the reader just experiences it.
Right.
And so many writers just try to write from the cerebral, but especially when you're writing trauma, when you're writing a lot of heightened emotions, you might not even be having clear thoughts about it. When I'm writing a very traumatic situation, I used to write everything from the top down, and then I would hate my own reading. I would be like, whatever is it? So I actually do write almost from the sensory motive perspective, where I'm like, what is the character's body experiencing? And because in that moment, especially fight scenes or trauma scenes where pain's being inflicted, these happen a lot in my stories, epic fantasy, that allows me to build an emotion to the point I never actually have to name the emotion for my reader, but my readers will come back and tell me what the emotion was.
Yep. So. Yeah, and there's something powerful about that. With somatic therapies, a lot of people try to make meaning right away. Trauma doesn't let that happen. Usually the meaning that we make is wrong. The meaning we make is the traumatic belief. Oh man, that deserved to happen to me. Oh man, I'm an awful person. The world is just never safe and never will be safe. Those are the meanings that we make of in the face of trauma. So one of the things somatic therapies, as well as other mindful-based therapies do, is they put a pause on the meaning making. So that way you don't have to make meaning, you don't have to think about it, but by allowing the body to process what it needs to, meaning will make itself apparent to you. There's stories and experiences, I've even seen this in my own work with folk, where you do some body work and then things change in the body, and then all of a sudden they go, oh wow, I just realized. And then they say something that's like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, right? And as a somatic therapist, I don't go like, you are correct, because it's not about what I think, it's about what you're learning and what the body is able to help you understand.
Yeah. And as a writer, that meaning making can change for our characters throughout the story. Like because we so often we try to make meaning of trauma, but that meaning can actually change. Like I know in my own therapy that changes, but for our characters also that changes where, they have an experience and their relation to that experience does not have to stay the same for that experience to still be valid.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
All right, so we just talked about narrative therapy, and we said we were going to talk about trauma-informed therapy and buzzword therapy. Do you want to take us out? Because I don't really know where you're going to go with that.
Yeah. So, and actually, in some ways, they're connected because trauma is a buzzword. I'll start with what I mean by that in terms of buzzwords. Because of a rise in awareness of how the tools, perspectives, outcomes associated with psychology have shown up, right? So you had like marketing firms and businesses doing guerrilla research that was psychological in its nature, right? You have all these things that suggest that, oh, there's some power here. There's some really interesting things here. And humans, at least in Western culture, we really like to be able to know ourselves. And we have such an emphasis on cerebralness and thought and identity that, wow, what a powerful tool, this psychology thing for getting to know myself, and the prospect of maybe there's something I don't know about myself because it's subconscious, right? Like, and so there's a lot of accessible popular psychology that's out there. And funny enough, professionals aren't entirely immune from that either, because we're also humans who generally have things like social media and read blogs and sometimes get hooked on ideas that may or may not be fully as they're presented. So to give an example, trauma, right? That's a huge word. That's a huge buzzword that gets shared and talked about a lot because of how powerful and important it is as a topic. That being said, it's often misunderstood, right? At its base, trauma deals with an umbrella of experiences. So yes, is being assaulted, is that traumatic? Yeah. That you could say that that's a trauma, but so is undergoing long-term periods of toxic stress. So is having a strained relationship with a caregiver or someone who you're emotionally close to. And so trauma kind of gets highlighted as this catch-all for everything. And it's used for like, yeah, I'm, anxiety is a trauma and this is a trauma. And I know that for me, I sometimes sound like that. But that's because when I talk about trauma, I'm talking about the systems and the body and how we respond to stress and distress.
So the marks that these experiences have left in us and on us.
Exactly. So a lot of times people will talk on like an identity level or a philosophical level about trauma and this is what trauma means within society. And I'm not trying to dismiss that. It's not the same thing as when I'm talking about trauma with a client or I'm treating a trauma. And so it's created this interesting experience of working with folk who come in with their own understanding of the world and their own understanding of themselves and what they're going through, and not imposing my values and will upon them and outright correcting things that maybe aren't quite perfectly right as I know them as a professional, but still getting them to a place where we can work with the systems in the body that are impacted by trauma or that are regulating responses to traumatic events as I've described them earlier.
So this brings up a curious question for me. In our podcast, we talk about a lot of different people groups, a lot of different ethnicities, nationalities, identities. Would you say that trauma is individualistic? Would some people experience a set of circumstances or an event, and someone else experiences a set of circumstances and events, and one might be traumatized by it and another not?
Absolute. I mean, the short answer is absolutely yes. The more nuanced one is that it kind of depends. We have this expectation, again, from what trauma means societally, what it means culturally, this meaning making we have around what trauma is different than like what just happens in the body and the things that we associate with responses to trauma. Elevated state, heart rate fluctuations, blood pressure fluctuations, chemicals in the body that show up, right? Like I know a lot of people come and say, oh yeah, I feel that adrenaline. And I'm like, maybe. I'm sure you're feeling the effects of the adrenaline. I don't think that you could differentiate that from cortisol or any of the over 36 chemicals that change when we're under stress. Right. And so we tend to put a cultural understanding of what that is and how people are supposed to deal with it. I remember hearing articles about, there's an article about a natural disaster in a developing nation, I think it was. I don't remember where. And newspaper was like, oh, these people are in shock. They don't even realize the trauma hasn't even set in yet. And the irony is that if you looked at their culture, they actually have a lot of tools built in already for dealing, because it was like a natural disaster that is woven into their fabric of understanding their world, because it's happened before and it's in their history. It's in their myths and folklore and all that sort of stuff. It's in their fabric. So they were able, but some would say they were able to come to terms with that and react in a way that we didn't see post-traumatic stress as we're used to seeing it. And I mean literally post-traumatic stress. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is a specific classification of criteria where post-traumatic stress shows up in a specific way. PTSD and PTS are like, they're not synonymous, they're different things. And so people were saying, yeah, these people, they're just not, they're so traumatized, they're in shock. They don't even realize how traumatized they are. And the mistake that was being made there, one could say, is that the journalists and people looking in on that weren't accounting for the resources that were built into this culture. And when it comes to being trauma-informed, one of the things that trauma-informed care includes is an understanding of the importance of resources. There's some theories of trauma that say if a person builds enough resources, you don't have to do trauma work. So for example, that sensory motor therapy I mentioned earlier, there's some conceptualizations of trauma therapy that's like, yeah, if you just get somebody enough resources where they feel safe enough in their body, confident enough in their life, etc., they may choose to not heal that through a modality in therapy. They might get to a place where they're like, no, I'm actually feeling good and I'm happy where I'm at. This is cool.
And that is still, I know we don't want to lay too many judgments on therapy, but that's still a viable outcome. That's still a success for them.
Absolutely. In therapy, in the more postmodern era, we've decided that people get to decide when they're where they need to be. Right? I cannot force somebody to heal. And it gets kind of douchey if I'm like, well, hey, brah, you're still exhibiting signs of mild hyperarousal, brah. Clearly you need to work on your trauma, brah. Like, that's not cool. Like, I am removing the autonomy and power of this aforementioned brah.
Exactly. So there's another word that goes around, and I'm starting to see it show up in fiction as well. So if we could lightly touch on it, because I know we have a lot more still to cover, and this episode's becoming quite long. Could you explain what CPTSD is? And is that even a diagnosis?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So diagnosis is an interesting thing. It's become more structured and formalized over the decades rather. What started out as just a way of understanding. So if you think about a car mechanic, they're going to diagnose the problem and then they're going to fix your car. That's a similar idea that showed up in psychology, psychotherapy. We borrow that terminology from the medical field. The origins of modern psychology and psychotherapy stem from the medical field. So we thought, well, the same way you diagnose a broken arm, you must surely be able to diagnose the mind. And well, then we have to be able to have an anatomy of the mind, right? So that's where you get, well, there's clearly an id, an ego, and a super ego, and all this other stuff, right? These assumptions that get built in. And the good news is that diagnosis has moved a little bit away from some of those assumptions. The bad news is that we pretend that diagnosis is one specific thing when sometimes research criteria, for example, does not match for the criteria of what's in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM-5. So to explain that, because I know I just threw out a bunch of heady, cerebral academic stuff, to put that really simply, I can read an article that defines and looks at the literature, the academic articles of something like complex post-traumatic stress disorder, complex PTSD or CPTSD. And I can go, wow, there's a lot of science here that makes sense. There's a lot of things we're observing. This is really helpful in helping me understand this specific thing, which I'll define in a moment what that is. Just bear with me here on, trust me that it's a thing. And then I open up my handy dandy DSM and there is no complex post-traumatic stress disorder.
There's no complex post-traumatic stress disorder in the DSM-5.
There is not. I believe it was recently added to the International Classification of Diseases, which is the sort of international version. And like insurance, for example, tends to use the ICD over the DSM. But in the main thing that I was trained on, that most professionals in the United States are trained on, there is no entry for CPTSD. There was almost an entry for it. I don't want to get into the particulars because I've heard different things and I haven't looked deep into that myself. The way that the DSM was originally done, the way that the DSM has historically been done in recent iterations has been by committee. They are moving away from that, which is super interesting. Now they're going to do it by kind of research proposal model. But not getting super caught up in the nerd science academia stuff. Complex PTSD is, when we use the term complex in psychology, we tend to mean pertaining to close, intimate relationships, family members, caregivers, right? So if I apply that idea of complex, so complex grief might mean I've lost a mother or I've lost a sibling that was really close to me. Okay. That's it's called complex because it usually ends up meaning like it's longer in duration, it's more nuanced in my reaction to it, right? I might have more intense bouts of grief, or there's different ways that the complex side of that literally means like, yeah, my grief is more complicated than it likely would have been if it was just like, a coworker.
Okay.
And so it's the same thing with CPTSD. Complex PTSD is generally thought of as a specific set of trauma symptoms that arise resulting from usually early childhood trauma, usually through caregivers, and often repeated, right? So in some ways, CPTSD is like what you would naturally expect, assuming you understand trauma, what you'd naturally expect if you just turned up the intensity and the frequency or the frequency of it.
So to give a fictional example of what someone who experienced things that might be CPTSD, Cinderella being raised by her evil stepmother, that would be CPTSD.
And not only that, I believe she loses her mother too.
Her mother died, her father remarried, and then her father died. And then the remainder of her childhood is under the evil stepmother being bullied by her two stepsisters.
Right. So it would not be surprising then if Cinderella were then to have heightened levels of anxiety and heightened levels of energy in circumstances where authority figures remind her of her family. And maybe she like reflexively appeases them, or maybe she freezes, or maybe she actually becomes super irritable and people around her are like not understanding what's going on because it almost seems erratic to them. They don't get that this is a manifestation of some really difficult times with people who were caring for her. And honestly, it's more like, it tends to be more complex with somebody that you love. But this isn't a hard and fast rule, but like you kind of expect with Cinderella, like the stepsisters are just so bad. You're just kind of like, well, fuck them. They're just awful. If any of your listeners are familiar with Sybil, that's a famous story that captures early ideas of what we now call dissociative identity disorder. That would definitely be CPTSD inducing. In a lot of ways, my understanding of CPTSD is that it's a catch-all for a lot of things that don't show up as like borderline personality disorder or dissociative identity disorder, these trauma-specific diagnoses that have certain patterns to them. It's like CPTSD has its own set of patterns that it's like, well, it's not borderline, but it has some things similar to it. Oh, and it's not dissociative identity. Like they're clearly in touch with which parts of them are speaking at which times, and they're congruent internally in that sense. But they are activated and have flashbacks, and will likely have sleep disruptions, will likely actively avoid situations that remind them, right? But to a certain degree and in certain ways that aren't always aligned with PTSD's criteria. Anybody that's interested in that, I would encourage them, if they have the wherewithal and the time and all that, to look at some of the academic literature on CPTSD. I don't have any names off the top of my head, but you're not going to find it in the DSM. You might find it in the ICD-6 or 7, whichever version is adding it.
All
I think
right.
it's going to be 7.
We'll put some links and resources in the show notes, but we could probably do an entire series having you look at fantasy characters, fictional characters, true crime characters, whatnot, and telling what they look like. But we're going to keep moving for today. And something else that I've seen show up in literature is 12-step programs, characters that are struggling with alcoholism or drugs or different types of addictions. And I was hoping we could just touch on that a little bit and contextualize the different ways that people might recover from that. One thing that's really, really famous in the US, at least, is the 12-step program. I know there's also alternatives to that. I think in all of my reading, I have only ever read one book by someone who did an alternative program to the 12-step. But I know that's also a growing thing. So I was hoping you could speak to that a little bit.
Sure. 12-step is one of the first that has legacy status because it's one of the first ways in which people had options to try and find ways forward through addiction. You may notice I'm being very careful with my words here because it's easy when talking about 12-step to default to the language that 12-step uses. And I want to be a bit more removed from it. Because it has this legacy, it has influenced the way we speak about addiction, the way we view it. It was not started by a psychological professional. I believe it was started by a medical doctor and somebody who was like a friend who was trying to help. And so they created this system. There's some challenges with it. It's very, nowadays we understand it to have it doesn't have what they call person first language. So person first language says, I'm dealing with addiction, or I have an addiction, or something like that. The opposite of that is I'm an addict.
Yeah,
right?
That's very familiar language to most of us in the US.
Mm-hmm. And so when 12-step works, which it does, the literature is all over the place with 12-step. Some articles will say it's fucking fantastic, it's the greatest thing ever. And some literature will say, like, actually, this is worse than nothing at all. It's evidence that in the social sciences, research can be very much about proving a point rather than empirically finding truth. Because there's just so much literature about that. When it does work, it seems to work because of the social ritual. And because of the community building, right? They say work the steps, but really what they say is keep coming to the meetings. And your identity gets reshaped by the group, and you believe what they believe. And I don't mean that in any dismissive way. It just you become a part of this culture that values what they call sobriety and recovery. And you are always going to be recovering. And you are fundamentally not able to indulge in the thing that you got addicted to because you are this type of person. And if you come to believe that, then you will be successful in 12-step. You could change the 12 steps in the 12-step program, right? You could change them, tweak them here or there, and you would still have the same type of people, in my opinion. You still have the same type of people that would find it successful. It's really about having that community and having the thing that you go to and being around people that remind you of what it is you're trying to do. So if
you're
you
stepping into a culture, literally.
Yeah. So if you have a character that is like this rugged individual and they're going to 12-step for treatment for alcohol or some other substance use, they're at some point going to have to grapple with that because not because you can't be in an individual in 12-step, but because like I've worked with folk who have had substance challenges and they'll be like, yeah, 12-step, I did not jive with that. I felt weird calling myself an addict. I mean, like, in some cases I've seen people who had challenges with addiction and they're like, yeah, I'm actually able to have a drink now. Like maybe they used to use cocaine just to make something up and now they have drinks. 12-step would say not possible. You can't. You are an addict by definition. You cannot do anything in moderation. Right. But these people who did not align with that ideology, they had to find other ways because they were never going to fit in there. It was never going to work for them.
It only worked for a certain kind of people in a certain kind of setting where they can maintain this community to maintain this identity that allowed them to become something else.
Mm-hmm. Correct. Yeah, correct. Some alternatives to AA. A lot of times what you'll see on TV.
AA being Alcohol Anonymous for anyone listening from somewhere else.
Yeah, sorry. And a lot of times I meant to say 12-step, but AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, was the original 12-step program. It has since been expanded to Narcotics Anonymous, Sex Anonymous, Overeaters Anonymous, all these other groups. They're all just 12-step is what they're called collectively. But so alternatives to 12 steps. So most of the time, if you see on TV, it's going to be actually, unless it's clearly 12-step and they're doing the whole like, I'm Bill and I'm an addict. Hi, Bill, and all this stuff.
It's going to be seen at least one of those scenes in a movie somewhere.
Right. The one alternative to that is actually a support group. Now, support groups, that's the one you see on TV where they put the chairs in a circle and they all sit around and there's a facilitator who might bring in a topic and people just have space to share. Support groups aren't necessarily, they're usually not therapeutic or clinical, I'll say. They're usually led by somebody who has enough experience in the thing that they're supporting. So if anybody who's seen The Punisher season 1 on Netflix, Frank Castle's friend, whose name I don't remember, he leads a support group for veterans.
Yeah,
right?
I remember that.
So that's an example of a support group. They don't have the same level of ritual that you see in AA. It's not structured the same. There's not the same emphasis of like tracking your sobriety. I mean, it could be, but usually the emphasis of, I'm 36 months sober or I'm this many months sober. That's a 12-step thing.
Okay.
And not every group or way of approaching recovery views it that way.
Okay. I think it was more of a support group that we also saw at the beginning of it's one of the Marvel movies where Captain America is leading Endgame, thank you. It kind of opens with one of those scenes where everyone that got lost in the blip.
Right, and Captain America is not a therapist, but he's still able to lead that group.
Yeah, you would call him a facilitator, right?
Yes, that's an appropriate term. Or sometimes you might say like, they're leading the group or something like that.
Okay. So was there anything else that you thought that we as writers should be aware of, things that are misrepresented in the media, or are we ready to move on to our next point?
If your listeners are looking for other alternatives, there's something called SMART recovery, SMART. And SMART is an alternative. It has its roots in things like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and other therapeutic forms. It sometimes includes mindfulness. They have support groups that are, they have support groups that meet, but unlike AA and 12-step, the point is for you to do like their workbooks and actually do the therapeutic work. SMART stands for self-management and recovery training. So the idea is that it empowers people to be in control of their recovery. Whereas something like 12-step, you have to acknowledge that you need the support of a higher power. SMART is Smart recovery is more like, well, this is yours. You decide this. And when you're feeling empowered to do this, here's steps you can take to become empowered to make changes around what addiction you're having trouble with.
So different characters with different character setups might respond differently. Like if I have that highly individualistic character, I can think of a couple I've written who would hear about 12 step and be like, I'm out, not even show up. Smart would give them their power back, which is what a lot of people who are looking to recover are actually looking for.
Yeah. And people can find power in 12 step, right? There is, as I'm sure you know, there can be power in things like surrender, or even in doing the 12 steps. Some people find that the steps give them a sense of empowerment. That being said, it's a very different kind of power, right? Like, and somebody like myself, I'm not, if I were to need support in this area, I would not find myself resonating at all with 12 step. I would find myself resonating with something more like SMART or support groups or some other form of recovery.
Okay. What kind of characters would you say might resonate best with 12 step?
Anybody that people that are already open to or accustomed to that level of ritual. One of the reasons why it can be so effective too is that in our society, we have a lot of language around shame. We have a lot of language around identity. And so if somebody out there is struggling with addiction, they might have a lot of feelings of shame. They might be like, man, I'm really feeling XYZ because I'm an addict, right? Or because, and there's a lot of internalization that's happening just naturally. And so that kind of person, 12 step might be very accessible to them because they don't have to be open to the possibility that they have power. They don't have to be open to the possibility that maybe the shame that they're experiencing isn't about them, right? 12 step doesn't necessarily dive deeper into that, especially early on. It's more about just like, we're going to be here and support each other, and you show up however you show up. And they say it like that, but then they also have a lot of language around like naming a person as a thing, right? So on one hand, there's an intentional effort to be inclusive, which is very cool, very helpful. And on the other hand, some of the language that they use is going to signal in very subtle ways to somebody that likes ritual, to somebody that feels that kind of shame or identity, to feel like, oh, this makes sense. This is where I belong.
Okay, so perhaps a character that at one time really appreciated, say, religious ritual is the first thing I can think of, like mass or a Lutheran church, kind of like the entire ritual of going to church and having the prayers, stand up, sit down, listen. It might, if that's something that I'm as writer hearkening back to, that might resonate more with them as a healing modality.
Yeah. Or even people that grew up in cultures or neighborhoods where church was valued, right? Whether or not they actually went to it. I've had limited experiences in churches, but I remember I was working out of a church once in my days before I was a therapist. And people were like, oh yeah, you should come to the church. And I'm like, no, thank you. Like, I appreciate it. I love and respect you as a person. I don't think so. And then I got a gig for Easter Sunday, and that one of the same people was like, oh, I'm so glad you're here. And I can't help but lean on that experience and go, nothing's changed. My views haven't changed. I'm just here because I got a gig and I'm being paid not very much money, but I'm paid to be here and I'm happy to be here. And this community is cool. You know, I got to know a lot of these people through my work. And so I could imagine that for somebody that grows up in a place where like, oh, you're supposed to go to church. You're supposed to do this, right? Like you're supposed to go to 12 step if you're having trouble with drinking. Then that's also the kind of character that's likely to feel at home or to feel drawn to, or eventually feel at home with 12 step.
Or if they're trying to heal their relationship with their community, finding a ritual to comply with that's meaningful to them allows them to become back in alignment with their community, even though they may have done something their community doesn't approve of.
Yeah, exactly. So I, a few months back, watched the entire series, The Wire. which, oh, wow. I'd seen bits and pieces at my dad's house back in the day. Parents were divorced and got to see every other Saturday. Dad had HBO and watched The Wire. And wow, it's even better than I remember. It's not without its issues, but one of the scenes in some of the mid to later series involve 12-step, right? And it's so interesting to see The Wire, for those who don't know, is a show from the early 2000s set in Baltimore, dealing with drug sales, organized drug sales gangs, and law enforcement using phone taps and things like that to bust them. And so you get to see one of the characters going through 12-step recovery who just had something really awful happen to that they were involved in. And it's interesting to see in these neighborhoods where it's really, really poor and really impoverished, and to see the way that these, 12-step groups show up. It's like, oh yeah, that makes sense. If you're in that kind of environment, that's going to feel a lot like going to church on Sunday, which most of the people in those communities did when they were kids.
So let's move into ethics. I know that when we were preparing for this episode, we had a few conversations that led to a lot of laughing about unethical therapy as shown on TV. I think the strongest scene that stood out to me was the therapy. I'm using air quotes here.
So many air quotes.
So many air quotes that I saw, and I know you've seen it too, in Hawk and the Winter Soldier. Am I saying it correctly?
Falcon and the Winter Soldier.
Falcon and the Winter Soldier.
Mm-hmm.
There's this really pivotal scene between the Winter Soldier and the Falcon, facilitated by, I believe, an army psychologist.
I don't know what she was. She was off the chain is what she was. Whew.
And as I brought it up, your eyes got really bad and you started shaking your head and you started talking about ethics and boards and licensing boards and shaking your head. Can you explain a little bit about ethics and then bringing that into fiction? Because I know that we often see unethical therapy. You already mentioned non-consensual therapy in Gotham, which I'd never heard the term non-consensual therapy before you brought it up.
Yeah,
I'm guessing that's also unethical.
I mean, so I have an advantage here because as a therapist, anybody that's sought therapy, or I think even psychiatry, they have to do it. And in anything that's serious in medical practice, they have to do this as well. You'll remember it's like, oh yes, welcome. I'm so-and-so, I'm licensed in so-and-so. You may have some risks to this. You may have some benefits. We have a cancellation, and it's like all this talking to just info dump a bunch of shit. We call that informed consent, right? And we cannot give therapy to somebody who has not consented to it. There may be some loopholes with that in terms of folk who are not able to give consent. You'll have to forgive me. I don't work with those populations, and it's been a while since I've refreshed myself on how best practices are with those populations.
So if you're a writer writing that, please go do additional research and look up consent for those populations.
Yes, for those who are not able to actively give consent. But so in that, that the part of that is within that, we're trying to allow people to know what's going to happen as just a good ethical practice. Now, ethics is not the same as legal. In theory, a therapist can do something unethical that is not illegal, and not just in theory, in practice. So if anybody's looking to learn more about ethics in psychotherapy, you're going to want to look at an ethical code. Each professional identity, from psychologists, counselors, school counselors, social workers, marriage and family therapists, they all have their own ethical codes. I believe the psychologist is just like gigantic because psychologists, that's something that they do. And the APA is very bureaucratic, at least is my understanding of it. If you want an easier place to start, you might look at, say, the mental health counselor, the ACA, American Counseling Association's ethical code. most ethical codes are not going to give you answers. They're going to give you things to consider and things you should avoid and things you should probably do. So for example, do no harm, right? That's not the same as help everyone. And it leaves a lot of ambiguity. Well, what does harm mean? And so then you have to employ something called an ethical decision-making model, or you have to use your best professional judgment.
So this is an area so complex, in my personal opinion, that I would be seeking someone like you as a sensitivity reader before I published, if it was a central part of the story or if I was trying to get it absolutely right. Just because, I mean, it's literally taken you an advanced degree and multiple years to get licensure to answer a question such as ethics.
Yeah, and the thing about ethics is when they're done, in older times, we had this idea of ethics, at least as far as I can tell in mental health, of like, ethics is a weapon. Oh, that's not ethical. And like nowadays, and the way I was taught is ethics is not a weapon. It's a place to be. It's a place to be uncomfortable. It's a place to ask good questions. And I had a boss who I remember was doing something. I was like, that's kind of sketchy, brah. What are you doing? And I was like, I have some ethical concerns there. And I was like, hey, maybe we should spend some time exploring the implications of this. Maybe we should check back and gut test if this actually feels like it's doing what you think and feels how you feel. And he got super defensive. Oh, don't come in here talking about someone being unethical. And it was like, okay, you clearly think that I came for you because I asked you to be in an area where your profession dictates you should sometimes from time to time visit, and it's not a bad thing. And I feel like that's a part of either a misunderstanding and or the old guard, maybe, because as an older psychologist that has a lot of viewpoints from that era.
Isn't it true that on occasion around like questions of ethics, etc., counselors, therapists, etc., will peer consult?
Absolutely.
Check themselves?
100%. There are also experts, and I'm probably going too deep in the weeds. There are literally people who are experts in things like ethics and law. Sometimes in ethics and maybe not in law. Sometimes in law, but maybe not ethics. There's a famous counselor / lawyer who works out of Washington State. I believe his name's Eric Strom, who does workshops on the law all the time. And I mean, what a better fit. He's literally a counselor and a lawyer.
That is a lot of schooling.
Right. And then there's another person that there's a couple people I can think of who their specialty is ethics. And I'm sure that they're decently familiar with the law in their state. But like, again, what they're there for is trying to help people sort out the ethical implications of what's happening or of a situation, help people to use ethical decision-making practices and models to come to a decision of what action they need to or don't need to take.
Okay. All right. I feel that we could dig into that a lot more, but I am going to keep us moving. I'm going to bring us back to talking about the process of writing and our own mental health again, if you're willing to do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, say we have gone through the process, we've worked through our own traumas, we've managed to write this book, we're happy with it, and now we are sharing it with the world. This precious, delicate thing that we have made.
My baby.
I mean, many people do refer to their book as their baby, at least for a while. People who have written about 5 or more, you see that language kind of drop off. They don't refer to it as their baby anymore.
Sure.
So, but anyway, when we're prepared to show this to the world, and this could happen at any point in our writing career when we write something close to us, or for some of us, it's every single book we write or story. And we give it to an alpha reader, or we are looking for a sensitivity reader to give us feedback, and we get feedback that might be negative or doesn't make sense at first.
Mhm.
And I've shared this story on this podcast before once, I think, where I had to gut check myself.
Mm.
But I wrote, this is actually the Adelaide series. I wrote a character that is exploring their gender sexuality. And I wrote a lot of her experiences in the first 3 books. She defines herself as female from the perspective of someone who is bisexual, myself. Like that's something she discovers
Mhm.
along her gender identity, orientation, etc. timeline. And I got feedback, and the feedback was, you hate trans people and you've written a book that will promote hate against trans people.
Oh
I
my.
I had, yeah, the feedback was literally like, have her like one gender. Like she either needs to like girls or like boys. And I had to throw the brakes on. I lost grounding, I lost perspective. I went into an emotional spiral for at least 15 minutes. And I was like, oh my gosh, because it felt like they had come for me.
Mhm.
And I was like, this is my own intense personal experience of not understanding why I thought girls were pretty and guys were awesome at the same time. And much like my character, I hadn't known as a child that that was possible. I figured I had to choose one or the other. No one told me that bisexuality is a thing. So to get this kind of response was, it felt like an attack on my own hard-won identity.
Right.
So I did have to do a lot of what we already talked about, that grounding, that compassion work, externalizing it, taking time. But how would you, what are things that you would recommend for someone, especially if the criticism is valid? Because we can
Mhm.
often write inside of our own trauma and then write something that's not balanced or valid from another perspective, and we need to incorporate that. And for
Mhm.
me, when I got that perspective, I reread my entire book, making sure to read it from the perspective of how I'd gone and talked to my friends who were trans, etc., making sure that I hadn't included anything. So I
Mhm.
did actually take that feedback under consideration, and I don't think I actually changed anything, but I did accept it. But how do we take criticism like this that we just don't know what to do with, seems to come out of center field,
Mhm.
and sit with that?
Yeah, I think that your story is a great illustration, and there's two ideas I want to share on the matter. The first is acceptance. And now I'm using acceptance a little jargony here. I'm going to allude to radical acceptance as is associated with things like dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT, as well as other philosophies and perspectives from that point of view. Acceptance does not mean tolerance. They are different things. So some people say, well, I don't have to accept that there's pollution in the world and that there's inequality between men and women and sex and gender minorities. Well, okay. The way that I'm using the word acceptance here and the way that it's regularly used from these perspectives is you don't have to tolerate that. You have to accept that it's there. You have to acknowledge, you have to accept that these things exist before you can take any action or intentionally take no action. Right.
So
And
that would
so,
be the sitting down and being like, all right, this advice exists. I'm hearing it. I'm not just screaming back at it. I'm actually hearing it.
and that extends further. So, to use your example, you accepted that you got this feedback. And I mean, it's kind of funny to say a little bit because it's like, yeah, it happened. Like, there's nothing we can do to change the fact that you didn't get that, like that feedback crossed your eyeballs, you read it, right? So like, it's kind of silly to say it. And you can approach this sort of thing with a little bit of playfulness. Maybe don't overdo it because you might dismiss yourself. But it's like, yeah, I read that. I just read that. And then you also accepted the 15 minutes where you were having trouble. You accepted that it was there. You acknowledged it was there. And then the other idea I want to share that I think is connected is resilience. And there's different ways to use the term resilience. And I'm just going to talk about one specific version. I like to put it on the other side of grit. I look at grit as, I got hit and I fell over and I got the fuck back up. That's grit. I'm going to stay with this thing that's really hard, and I'm just going to dig deep and I'm going to do it. Again, it's not the most nuanced understanding of grit, but bear with me. I promise it can be useful. Resilience is, wow, I just got knocked on my ass. Let me go home and heal. Let me come back from this. Let me give myself space and grace. Maybe I can use this to learn to defend myself under these circumstances, or to know that I can get back up, right? And so we build resilience by doing the things that you just described, of having the moment of, this is my reaction. Okay, I'm not going to dismiss it. I'm not going to fight it immediately, right? That's our usual instinct. And that's a grit instinct, is to fight.
I did not write an email back that day, that week. I took my time.
And so we do things like this, where we accept that we got the feedback, we accept it was said, we accept we heard it, we accept that we had reactions to it. And then, authors are, by definition, y'all have to be so resilient. It's one of the reasons I'm not sure I could be a freaking author. You just get beat so often, and you have to get back up, and everybody's a damn critic. I mean, I'm a critic. I talk shit on all sorts of stuff that I've read, like, oh, this author doesn't know what they're talking about. I can't imagine receiving my own criticism. I need to work on my resilience. And through that, you authors are able to keep showing back up and to keep writing. And hopefully, with the right tools, environment, and empowering circumstances, you're able to do it in such a way that you grow rather than stay stuck, because that resilience and that acceptance allow for the experiences to change and move you into a place you're trying to be.
How can we take some advice where we have, I'm going to just say it bluntly, messed up? Like, we wrote something and it missed the mark. I mean, I've done this. I've definitely received feedback, and I'm like, oh, so I left all the important pieces of that scene in my head. Yeah, it came off wrong. Or it came off as disrespectful to a people group, or it just fell flat for the reader. They didn't have the experience I wanted. Do we need to forgive ourselves? Because I feel like the concept of resilience includes both when we take a hit and we're like, yeah, that was one person's experience of my work, but I'm going to keep going because their perspective came from a certain place and it wasn't educated. And for me, I realized that the person who had given me the feedback didn't know what bisexuality was and didn't validate that as an orientation. And then I was able to move past it. But in another case, I received feedback on a different character in a different book, and I was like, oh yeah, that's valid. How can we take this concept of resilience and keep writing without just getting angry with ourselves?
So there's wow, that's such a big question. And it's not necessarily a big question because it's a big question, which it is. It's big question because it has 50 billion answers. And obviously, I'm going to stick to the ones that I think will most empower your listeners to remain connected to their mental well-being as best they can. This is one of the reasons why one of the things I go back to in my life and in my work is compassion. If I can put a boundary on what the other person's experiencing, and by boundary, I don't mean like, I'm like, get out of here, other people's feelings. It's more like, I can say that person is having a reaction. And I start there. That person is having an experience. What are they feeling? I'm building natural barriers, right? And I'm not asking what are they feeling because I want to feel it. I'm asking it so I can observe what they're feeling, right? And then I can observe within myself. And through that, I get to decide, well, where is the suffering that I can engage with? Maybe I start with my own. Maybe I start with acknowledging, man, that hurt. That really hurt. And there are parts of me that are having trouble with this. And I can observe those parts, maybe offer them kindness. Maybe I bring it up to my therapist who's able to hold space for me while I go through my process. And then, I think I'd be remiss to not mention that in today's society, with everything that we ever say on the internet being a part of a permanent record, and the cultural implications that come from that, and I don't really want to come off as sounding as those folk who are like, oh, you can't say anything today, because I think that those folk are coming from a certain place with a certain perspective that I don't really that I have trouble accepting. I have trouble tolerating, to better use words. I do also think that it's really hard to make a mistake these days, and because a lot of culture we have has gotten very combative about mistakes and about how we show up. And so that's something that we can acknowledge and include in our practices of compassion. Yeah, somebody on the internet is really having a trauma response to what I said. And I don't say that to dismiss their trauma response. I don't say that to make myself feel better, right? Because I'm not really going to make myself feel better on a deep level. I say that to start putting a boundary on what is my experience and what is someone else's. And yeah, I'm having a reaction to their experience, and I can accept and observe that too. And then that allows me to make empowered choices.
And an empowered choice can be rewriting something, getting more education on something, going back, asking the person who gave us the feedback to clarify. I think all too often, as writers, we put pressure on ourselves to get it right before anyone sees it.
Right.
But we can give ourselves, I'm not sure if it meets the way you say resilience, but I know I think of it as resilience, where I give myself circles of risk, where I share my writing with like an editor I trust, and then an alpha reader I trust, or something like that, where I know, okay, if they come back and dislike it, or this is the amount of fuck up I accept for myself, but this person will hold the boundaries for me to mess up in. And if I mess up with this person, they're going to give it to me straight, and I can have my feelings about it. I might even have a good cry. I might even feel some guilt, but it's going to be a space in which I can grow. And then after that point, someone else gets to read it.
Yeah.
And once I publish, this is just me personally, once I publish, I've gone through my system and I'm like, all right, it's out there. I'm not accepting criticism anymore. I'm not rewriting it. It's gone through my tests. And I kind of built my resilience in first, because I'm like, well, I know some people already liked it. I did all my checks. I'm not going for anyone.
Right.
So
yeah.
I don't know.
And I like that as a process. I think too that something that stands out to me there is, if we're thinking about how trauma, the trauma responses and in the body, and how that shows up in patterns of behavior and thoughts, etc., there's always this balance of safety and movement. Right? If I'm at a place where my experience is so strained and difficult and so much burden to it, I'm not going to be able to move, right? But if I'm only moving, how can I feel safe? Right? Like, and that's not to get super into the weeds on you on it, but that's something that can happen with folk who have more persistent traumatic experiences, more long-term toxic stress, higher intensity, etc., is that it's kind of a runaway train effect, where it's like, well, I just have to do the thing, and just as soon as I do it, I did it. Okay, done. And then, right, it's like, if I can just do it faster with less awareness, then I don't have to feel as much pain. And so to balance that out, it's like, well, okay, but you're probably still going to feel pain, because you're then going to regret it later, or you're going to get yourself into an experience where you have to slow down, or, maybe you realize, I don't want to live life a runaway train. And so what do? You come back to that balance of safety. You check in, what feels safe? What feels safe enough? What do my parts need? What is there a part of me that really needs me to slow down on this one thing, but it can move faster over here? And having those conversations internally with yourself from a place of observation and calmness and groundedness.
One way to slow down from the perspective of writing and editing is send a sample to an editor or send a sample to a alpha reader or a beta reader and not your whole book. Don't spill it all your guts. Like, see how they handle something small first. And then you can build trust and safety with that person for you to have those conversations or even build the conversation with someone so that when they come at you with a piece of advice, it's easier to take if you know that they're coming at you from a place of respect already.
Yeah.
All right, so say we've been writing for a while, we've written some really good books, we've had a lot of success, we've done our trauma work, we're in the flow of things, and then life just starts getting harder and harder, and it's hard to write, and we're like, I'm still sleeping, I'm sleeping too much, I can't sleep at all. And we've hit that point that, socially we're talking about more and more, and I'm hearing more and more authors talk about it too, especially if they hit like year 5, 8, 10 in their careers, and you realize I'm burned out. I have hit burnout. I know this is a really big topic, and so I'm gonna ask to let's just give a couple of things and then move on. But what can we do? Because in some careers, you can hit burnout and show up and just robot your way through life, and it's okay. But if you hit burnout as an author, your readers know. Like, I can name authors that publicly burned out for 5 or 6 books, and their readers will openly say, yeah, I just skipped those books in that series. They were phoning it in.
Wow. Yeah.
And it's so for authors, especially those of us who have a career, who have been working, our emotions is our currency. It's really hard to phone in anything, but that's often what all we have left when we hit burnout. So what
Sure.
are a couple of things to turn that ship around? I don't expect you to tell us how to heal it here. You should probably get help for that, but recognize it and then 1 or 2 small steps to turn that around.
Yeah. So burnout, like many other experiences, can have it will have a very individual component to it that is uniquely yours, right? Like, I know one of the things that makes psychology interesting is noticing in ourselves what we see in others and what we see in articles we read. But that being said, first and foremost, check in with yourself. You'll probably be able to, assuming that someone's connected with their body and is aware of what's going on in their world, there will be signs that you can notice that, oh, yes, I'm hitting burnout. And it's things like, is your appetite changing? Is your sleep changing? Are you feeling irritable? Have you noticed that it's been a while since you haven't felt kind of stressed out? Right? Like, these are all pretty common signs, and they're going to show up for people in different ways. So check in with yourself, trust yourself. Do you feel super burdened by oh yeah, I got to sit down and write? Fuck. Be aware, be connected. And then healing burnout is a much more complex thing. It sometimes can be changing a small thing in your routine or taking a vacation or a break. It can mean trauma work. It can mean changing your relationship to the thing you're burned out on. It can mean changing your relationship to your identity or changing a piece of your identity. So if you're at the higher ends of that spectrum, therapy, yoga, do something for yourself with the intention of healing is what I would strongly encourage. And on the lower ends, just making sure that you're connected with the things that give you joy and positivity and support. That's a fancy word for that is resources, whether that's a meditation practice, relationships, friends, family, a nice cup of coffee in the morning, love and kindness meditation in the morning, whatever. Just, you can't have too many of those resources, and know that they're there. Allow yourself to savor them.
As writers, there's often a lot of outflow, especially when we're writing a lot, where we just flow. And for me, it's like emotions coming out of my chest and hitting the page. And I do believe we can write ourselves out. And if we don't bring in and fill ourselves back up, I often think of it like emotions being a cup. And with writing, we pour that out into the page over and over again. Some people say, you got to leave blood on the page. You haven't done a good job till you left blood on the page. And yes,
There's something wrong with your keyboard.
I'm actually one of those writers that kind of ascribes to that notion, but for my genre. I think there are genres where you don't have to do that. Mine, not so much.
Gotcha.
But especially for certain kind of writing, I think this changes by genre and by the characters we're working at. But we can forget that if we pour out into our books, we have to also intake, or we will eventually be empty, which is burnout.
Sure. Well, and I think that there's some ways that metaphor can be stretched too. There's some, and I almost said evidence, but I realize that sounds like scientific evidence, which is not what I mean. I mean like anecdotal evidence and just general things that we sometimes see in the world. There are folk who are more enriched in the way they approach and live life. And for me, I tend to, unless you have somebody that like, that's all they do and they're just freaking fantastic at writing, I tend to like to engage with people that have a richer experience, right? So if you're, I remember in music school back in my previous life talking about, if you want to stay committed to teaching music, you need to be going out and like finding things that help you connect you with your passion. Like, are you getting new gear that's fun and exciting? Are you learning new songs? Are you learning new concepts? And the idea being that will help you to stay connected to what it is that you do and some of the motivations that we can't as easily put into language of why you're doing it.
That's why a lot of veteran writers will tell writers who are coming up through the ranks, don't stop reading fiction if you're writing fiction. So a lot of people get so focused on, I'm going to spend all my time writing fiction, and they stop reading fiction, which is the reason they wanted to write it in the first place.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very, very much. I feel like I have picked your brain extensively for the last, I don't even know how long. I would like to leave our listeners with something they can do today to just help them stay calm, keep showing up for the practice of writing, showing up for the things that they write about. And I think you brought something short that they could engage in.
Yes, I wanted to go over some basics of breath and give 2 breath exercises. I'm gonna, for the interest of time, I'm guessing it makes sense to make the diagnostic part a little shorter, so just focusing more on the exercises themselves.
I think we have talked about the diagnostics a little bit, so let's just hit it quickly and then move on to the exercise.
Oh, we haven't talked about the diagnostics. It's a mechanical thing.
Oh, my bad. I'm gonna leave it to you. You're the expert.
Okay, so if you would like to participate in this, I'm just gonna lead you through some breathing here. And I'll start with some just general quick pointers. And if you wanted to learn more, there are great resources out there, as well as you could reach out to me through this podcast and I might be able to answer some questions and give more details. But the emphasis is going to be on breathing a little bit slower and breathing lower in the body. So if you're breathing up into the shoulders and you notice that there's a strain on your neck, that's not what we're going for. It's likely going to produce tension in the body. Just emphasize expanding the belly gently. Don't overdo this, especially if you've not done it before. I've pulled muscles trying this stuff out. It's not fun. And you can do this standing, please not while operating machinery. And just start by noticing how you're breathing right now. And you can release the temptation to alter how you're breathing for this moment. We're just going to start by inviting in that sense of observation. Getting a tiny bit curious. How is it that I'm breathing right now? Maybe seeing what it feels like as the exhale becomes the inhale. Maybe seeing what it feels like as the inhale becomes the exhale. And now you can invite the breath to slow just a bit. And in fact, we're going to start with what we call ratio breathing. And just give yourself an inhale count of 4 and an exhale count of 4 to start at your own pace. If you're noticing you're getting headaches or lightheaded, ease off, allow your pace to be a bit more natural. If you're looking for something deeper, you can play with the intensity and power of the breath, like a powerful breath like that, or even a breath that's less powerful, that is silent to the ear. Just let this be playful. Experiment. And when you feel like you've had enough time experimenting, now start to stretch the exhale to a 6 count. So you're going to inhale at a comfortable or slow 4 count for yourself, and you're going to exhale at a comfortable or slow 6 count for yourself. So in for 4. And then once you're done with that, in for 4 and out for 6 at your own pace. And you can keep playing with the intensity or power of the breath or the subtleness of the breath. You can even start to notice how the focus on the breath impacts your body. So it's almost like the breath is in the foreground and you notice your body in the background. You can still see it. You can still notice it. And maybe if you've had practice with this before, or you're feeling exceptionally adventurous, you can expand that exhale from a 6 count to an 8 count. So breathing in that deliberate 4 and breathing out a deliberate slow 8, if you can. If that's not a part of your it's not an accessible part of the practice for you today, you can go back to 6. You can even do 4 and 4. The idea behind this, there's a few. One is that intention to the breath helps to calm parts of the nervous system. There's also an association with the exhale with the rest and digest, the parasympathetic nervous system, which is counter to the fight and flight sympathetic nervous system. And so by practicing breathing out longer than you breathe in, you're likely inviting more activation of rest and digest. And if you're noticing any tension in the body or the breath, just do what you can to make it smooth and easier than it was. Yes, you can challenge yourself a little bit. We also don't want the body to be tense because that teaches the body to be tense when we're trying to invite air and put an emphasis on the breath. And when you feel like you've had enough dose of this practice, you can observe the last bits of things for you to observe in this moment. And you can slowly bring the awareness back, maybe checking in with the external environment, allowing the inner experience to be present alongside the external experience, and noticing as you return from this practice if there's any part of the experience that jumps out of you. Maybe you feel calmer, maybe you feel something else, maybe there's sensations in the body you're connected with. So long as it is safe and you don't feel overwhelmed, that experience is welcome and it is valid.
Thank you very much for that.
My pleasure. I'm hoping that it serves you and everybody who is still listening to this episode.
I'm sure they probably are. We all need a moment to relax and reset. So I'm just going to say thank you. And we will place resources and links in the show notes. If anyone has more questions for Eric, please send them through to the podcast, Doing Diversity in Writing at gmail.com. Thank you.
Thank you for having me on.
Thank you for joining us. Music for this show was written and produced by Eric Mills. If you found this episode helpful, please rate and review on your favorite podcast app and spread the word so other writers can find us too. To get our Doing Diversity in Writing Toolkit, which includes all bonus material from Season 1, go to representationmatters.art. That's .art. Here you will also find our episode show notes. Happy writing and see you next episode!